CEEY, a leading think tank in Mexico, is hosting the Social Mobility Summit 2016. Some of the world's main experts will come together to discuss and help establish a broad agenda for research and policy making. Follow us via live streaming at socialmobilitysummit.org.
So why don't we just continue with session 3 about social mobility in the Americas. If the speakers can come to the front, Carlos Antonio Costa Ribeiro, Michelle Jackson, and Patricio Solís. Juan Enrique Huerta is going to be the moderator.
My name is Juan Enrique Huerta, and I'm excited to be here this afternoon. In the spring of 2015, by initiative of the Espinosa Yglesias Research Center, we celebrated at the Stanford Center on Poverty and Inequality the colloquium on social mobility in the Americas. Thanks to David Grosky, we were able to bring the attention of a number of scholars, some of them join now again. In the spirit of that colloquium, this session now is called Social Mobility in the Americas, and I have the privilege to present now scholars that also attended the generous invitation of the Espinosa Yglesias Research Center last year at Stanford. First, we will listen to Carlos Costa Ribeiro. Carlos is professor of sociology at the Institute of Social and Political Studies at the State University of Rio de Janeiro. Professor Costa Ribeiro is the author of 3 books and many papers on topics related to social mobility, economic inequality, and race relationships. He was also responsible for the social dimensions of Inequality Household Survey, a national representative survey collecting information on social stratification in Brazil. His research focuses on the determinants of socioeconomic opportunity within and across generations. Welcome, Carlos.
I'd like to thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to discuss part of my work with you. I'm not going to talk exactly about measurements of social mobility and things like that. I've done some work on occupational mobility, a little on income mobility, but this one is going to be different, this presentation. It's going to be about horizontal stratification of higher education in Brazil, and to see class, gender, and race difference, and also the labor market outcomes. It's a work I've done with this friend of mine, Flávio Carvalho. Social mobility, higher education is very important for social mobility, because we know that the most difficult barrier of mobility is to enter professional classes, occupations, and to enter these occupations you need higher education. So higher education is, access to higher education is key to reach professional occupations and therefore to have upward mobility. Therefore it is important to study not only the access to higher education, but also, as we know, any level of education, and higher education special, it's very stratified horizontally. Not all universities and diplomas have the same value. So it's very important to see how people reach, how different people from different social background reach these different careers or fields of study. And then this is going to have an implication for how they do in the labor market. Depending on the diploma you have different returns in the labor market. So I'm going to present some analysis on these 3 aspects of access to higher education and the outcomes related to higher education. So expansion in higher education in Brazil. During the last 13 years or 15 years, there was the highest, expansion of higher education in Brazil. Mostly, it was mostly private universities, but also public universities. There was never before such an expansion, such a rapid and fast expansion. So during this period, the government was implementing many policies trying to expand higher education. Like I listed some here, like ProUni, these are scholarships, or FIES, this is some public credit to students, affirmative action, and Reuni, that was an expansion of the public universities, opening new courses and new campuses. So it was a period of high, the expansion was very impressive. like 146% increase in all vacancies in the universities, mostly in private universities, but also in public universities. And it's important to have in mind that private universities in Brazil are lower quality, and public universities are better quality in general. So the expansion was mostly of lower quality vacancies in the university. So this expansion was designed by the government as a way of increasing social mobility. As a, it was, the propaganda was, we are expanding higher education, this is gonna increase social mobility. So, but the expansion was not even among all fields of study. Some fields of study, it's very hard, it's gonna be hard in this presentation sometimes to see all the names here because it's 35 courses. But anyway, some courses expanded more, like business and law, engineering here, or technological course, but others like medicine, for example, didn't increase a lot, and so forth and so on. And so we have to see that the expansion was not, to analyze how this affects the outcomes and how people enter there. So, as I said, the expansion was larger at private sector, and in some fields of study, mainly this one I listed here, business, education, technology, and engineering. So, so that our hypothesis is that the increased number of lower SAS, socioeconomic status, women and non-white people reaching university enter disproportionately in private universities and institutions and in lower prestige fields of study. So we have this idea. When I'm talking about lower SAS here is the family background, it's not the person, of course. So consequently, the labor market outcomes in terms of earning, for example, would be unequally distributed among these groups, these socioeconomic background groups, racial groups, and gender. So I will present three transitions related to that. First, what we call vertical stratifications, the access to higher education, to university, for those who completed high school. And then horizontal stratification of higher education, mostly among fields of study. As I said before, 35 fields of study. And then the returns to higher education. So income difference among fields of studies. So that's the idea here. So transition from higher school to university, let's see. So I use a model to see if these students did not enter university, enter public university, or enter private university. And then the variables are sex, race, socioeconomic background, type of high school, public and private. Also, private high school are better than public high school. It's another specificity of the country in general. And controlling for region and age. So the results of this analysis are pretty standard. There is no gender inequality to enter university in this data. Racial inequality to enter university is not very high, it's low, but it's present. Effects of type of high school are highly correlated with socioeconomic background, and socioeconomic background is the inequality, of class of origin, let's say, is high. So we can see this in this graph, for example. It's the predicted probabilities. So we see that when the higher your socioeconomic background, the lower the probability of not entering the university, and the higher the probability entering public university or private universities. So that's the sort of thing we see in this kind of analysis. So let's go for the horizontal stratification. Higher education is horizontally stratified, mostly in terms of fields of study. They're very different, and this expansion of the government created new courses. So of higher education. So some fields of study are more selective than others. Then I analyze this using also a multinomial model, and having these variables as background, race, gender, family of origin, and so on. And also, what's important is in this particular data set, we have some information on a test score on verbal ability, which is not perfect because verbal ability, some fields in like social science or humanities, they have high scores than they have in math tests, for example, which are important. But in any way, it's a way of controlling the best we have here in this data. So these are all the courses, the fields of study, just to have an idea. And these are the results from the analysis. So here, what I present here is like in each, this side are the dots are people, white people have more chances than black people, than non-white people, or mostly black and pardos, of entering these courses, while at this side we have blacks having more chances. So I gave some examples here. For example, in engineering, whites have a little higher chance of entering. In medicine too, while blacks have more chances to enter in education or social work. So there is a channel here of entrance. The same thing for sex. So you have stratification here. Some courses are more likely that you have women, like social work again, or education, and others like engineering or computer science, you have more men. Men have better chances of entry. And medicine is in the middle here. Medicine is the most selective course. So, and then this is for socioeconomic background again. We have here these are the high SAS background people who have more chance of entering this course here, and low SAS people, social background people have more chance of entering this. So we see, after all, some, whoops, I did something wrong here, okay. And this is just crossing the gender gap here, the gender difference here with the SAS difference here. So we have a map here of four areas. You know, here is courses that are more likely for men with high SAS, women with high SAS, men with low SAS, and women with low SAS. So it's difficult to see because there's a lot of points that are in the middle here, and some courses are very, stands out here, like medicine or computer science, and here this group, which has like it's education, nutrition, and other courses are here, but we can do a zoom on that to see better. And so these, we have then some course here which are like engineering, which are for high SAS men, high SAS women go to dentistry more, and so on and so forth. So we see that there is the access to higher education, and among the different fields of study is very, stratified. And we can, like, just summarizing what's the stratification like. We have men have higher chance of entering science fields such as engineering, computer science, and agronomy, and women have higher chance of entering fields related to education or healthcare or service, such as education, speech therapy, nutrition, social work, executive secretariat. For SAS, we have also this sort of stratification, like people with high SAS entering more in professional courses, like medicine, law, and engineering and law, and those there. And low SAS people enter more in courses related to education or social care, like literature, math, education, which is a very big course, and social work, and so on. And for race, also the same kind of pattern. You know, we have like white people more chances of entering the professional course, and non-white people more chances of entering course related to education and also social care, like library science, education, social work. So we see that in the entrance to the university, there is a lot of stratification, not only in the chances of entering the university, but the fields that people go, and if they go also to public or private. So there is a strong stratification in the entrance that will have some consequence for returns to higher education, which in Brazil are very high. This is a rough calculation, is still correcting it, but we see that the difference between having a high school diploma and having a third grade diploma is very high in general in the country. For men, as usual, it's higher for women, but this sort of measure doesn't see the difference among the courses, among the fields of studies. So the next thing we are working on is to see the returns to these different higher education these higher education fields of study, and see how these match in terms of income. This is a first calculation, interesting. So we see here would be the mean without accounting for all the different fields, and here is the income, return for all the different fields. And we see that at this side, incomes that are higher than the mean are like in the professional diplomas. These are from people who had the diplomas actually. And at this end, we have the course of low income. So somehow the higher education system helps to reproduce some sort of inequality that happens in the entrance, and then when you go out having returns, you have some also the inequality. So the idea is that we have to take more care and look more to horizontal stratification and horizontal educational stratification. So that's it. Thank you.
Our second speaker this session is Patricio Solís. Patricio is a professor at the Center for Sociological Studies at Colegio de México, where he also serves as editor-in-chief of the journal Estudios Sociológicos, Sociological Studies. He's a published author and editor of 3 books in social mobility and stratification. His most recent volume, published by the Espinosa Yglesias Research Center, offers a comprehensive perspective of social stratification and equality of opportunity patterns in Latin America. Welcome, Patricio.
Thank you very much also to CEEY for the invitation to present in this meeting. What I'm going to present is mostly the summary of the main findings of a comparative chapter about intergenerational class mobility in Latin America. That is part of a book. Can we go forward? I have it here. Okay, there you go. It's a book that was just recently published. The name is in Spanish, y sin embargo se mueve, Estratificación Social y Movilidad Intergeneracional de Clase en América Latina. It's coordinated by myself and Marcelo Guado from Uruguay. It was published by El Colegio de México and CEEY very recently, a few months ago. And but the book, in a way, can be described as an attempt to bring together or close the gap between the mainstream of international sociological research on intergenerational class mobility and the sociological research that had been done on social mobility by sociologists in Latin American countries. So what we did is we assembled together a group of researchers and put together this book. The collaborators are there. Carlos Costa Ribeiro is part of that project with the chapter for Brazil. And so we have chapters for each of these countries: Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Mexico, Peru, and Uruguay, which account more or less for 68% of the population of Latin America. And we use a national representative surveys from the period 2005-2010. And what we do basically is we approach the measurement of intergenerational class mobility using the standard international methodology used for the analysis of intergenerational occupational class mobility in the sociological field. That means mostly or basically that we use a comparative class scheme. We use a comparative class scheme, the scheme used by or proposed by Erickson, Goldthorpe, and Portocarrero, which is a 7-class occupational class scheme. And we use standard measures of absolute mobility and of relative mobility. And that allows us to compare not only across Latin American countries, but also to compare with European countries, which have already published and available data for similar measures of mobility. So what I'm going to present, the national chapters present a framework of the discussion of social mobility in each country, and it's very interesting to read them for that reason, because they present how social mobility has been discussed in each country, and they also present the historical context of changes in social mobility, and they present much more specific details about measures of social mobility in each country that I'm not going to be able to present here. But what I'm going to focus today is on try to make a summary, a very quick summary of our main comparative findings. And so, I'm going to focus on seven empirical results. The first one, and this should not come as a surprise, is that the class structures in Latin American countries vary significantly between those countries. This is the description of the 7-class scheme that we use. We use the service class. I'm not going to be able to go in detail to describe each of these classes. I don't have a lot of time. But these are managers and professionals mostly. These are office workers mostly. These are self-employed workers. We have here basically the working class. We have semi and skilled manual workers, and then we have farmers, and then workers in agriculture, dependent workers in agriculture. And so what you can see here, you have Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Mexico, and Peru. Again, I cannot go in detail analyzing the differences between these countries, but what I want to point out is two things. First, look at Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Mexico. They have difference among them, but they more or less have the same pattern. But look at Peru. This is the proportion of workers, agricultural workers, that currently Peru has. And so this basically is a warning sign for all of us. We are analyzing 4 countries that are among the most developed countries in Latin America. And then we have Peru there, which shows us that basically all the countries, or most of the countries not included in this study, may have a class structure more similar to Peru than to the rest of these Latin American countries that we are analyzing. And that's why we are saying that the class structures in Latin American countries are very heterogeneous, despite the fact that we have only one country in our sample that is completely different than the others. But then, more interestingly so, there's a clear underdevelopment, I will say, of the skill positions in Latin American countries as compared to European countries. So the green bars represent the class structure of European countries, and so we have here the service class, professionals, managers. So this is Latin America without Peru, with Peru, without Peru, and this is Europe at the mid-90s, more or less. So there's a 10-year lag there. And these are skilled manual occupations. And so basically, the first main finding of our study is this underdevelopment of skilled class, which of course represents a structural constraint for collective upward occupational mobility. Second finding, the marginal distributions of origins, that's fathers, and destination sons, in the mobility table reflect both rural-urban transitions and the historical expansion of non-manual positions. The two things are reflected in these marginal distributions. But there's only a moderate contribution of this structural change to absolute mobility. So this can be shown quickly in this graph, which basically compares what is the difference in the occupational distributions of parents and sons, and what you see is what you expect from a structure that is urbanizing and changing towards highly skilled positions, in some countries more than others, like this is the case of Brazil, and in Mexico, and in Peru, the larger reductions are in the rural occupations, in the rural classes, and basically most of the gains are at the top of the occupational structure. So you have a change, you have a transition between fathers and sons in terms of the direction of upward mobility, but then when you summarize this in a similarity index, you have moderate changes in some countries more than others. Brazil is 30%, that's important, but then you have Chile, 14%, Mexico, 23%. Peru is also high because of the transition from rural to urban settings between fathers and sons. And then Argentina is only 13%. So you have a moderate contribution of a structural change to social mobility. So you could expect with these changes, with these moderate changes, low mobility rates in the mobility table. But however, we have to take also into consideration the exchange movements between fathers and sons that cancel each other and that are not reflected in these marginal distributions. And so basically we have to make a direct measurement of social mobility with the mobility table and taking into consideration that. And so here comes the third finding. Absolute mobility rates in Latin America are remarkably high in terms of class mobility, much higher than mobility forced by structural changes. Upward mobility is predominant. So basically these are the direct measurements of intergenerational class mobility from the mobility table. So as you can note, more than 60% in all countries, more than 60% of sons have a different occupational or class position than their parents. And this is the similarity index that I showed you before. So basically, this red part of the bar shows the amount of mobility that we're observing beyond the forced movement of the marginal distribution. So we have much higher mobility than that is forced by the structural change in the distribution. And so we can be more strict and define a class scheme that is based only on 4 macro classes, and then you will find more or less the same results. Well, of course, it's reduced mobility because we have only 4 classes and not 7, so our table becomes a table of 4 by 4, 16 cells versus 49 cells in the mobility table. But then we have mobility rates also above 50%, and most of it is upward mobility. 4th finding. Okay, measures as we discussed before within economic mobility, but it also applies to class mobility. Measures of absolute mobility are affected by the marginal distributions. So in order to analyze the association, the net association between origins and destinations, net of marginal change, we must use measures of social fluidity, which is the term that is used in the sociological field for relative measures of social mobility based on log linear models. So basically we obtain an index that is the phi coefficient, which basically measures the net association between parents and sons in terms of class mobility in the table. And so the finding is this: social fluidity presents variations across Latin American countries, but overall levels are similar to those observed in European countries at the end and the middle of the 90s. And so here we have the data. This data the European data comes from the book of Bring and Luch, published in 2004, Social Mobility in Europe. Actually, they were very kind of giving me the data so I could recalculate and weight all these phi coefficients using the whole sample together of countries. And so as you can see, this is a measure of rigidity, not of fluidity. The larger the measure, the more rigidity exists in the mobility table. As you can see, Chile, Argentina, and Mexico are more or less in the same level that Ireland, France, Italy, and Germany. Brazil a little bit lower, and the case that presents higher fluidity is Peru, which of course, as we know, and I told you before, has experienced a huge transformation in terms of the transition from rural to urban settings. Not just to give you a figure, 66% of current people working in Peru have a parent who was working in an agricultural occupation. So it's huge, the change observed over a generation. Fifth finding, there is no evident association between distributional inequality, income inequality, and social fluidity. So the great Gatsby curve does not apply with intergenerational class mobility. As you can see there, we have the Gini index, and then against the phi scores, including the European countries, which are at the left, and the Latin American. I can grab them together, and they don't confuse each other because we have very different levels of income inequality, of course, and so Latin American countries tend to go to the right. And so, but then in both cases, you don't see any association, or a strong association at least, between income inequality and the net association between class origins and destinations. Finally, I don't know how much time do I have? I have only 5 minutes, so I'm gonna just show you this, or read this to find it. I'm not gonna, because I want to use my time at the end to show you something else related to the association between class mobility and income mobility, which is something I think is important in this table. I guess I'm the first one here talking about class mobility. There are strong macro class hierarchies, which are the main factor driving social mobility and mobility in Latin America. And Latin America, as compared to Europe, presents a more polarized pattern of social fluidity. The average levels, as I showed you before, are similar, but when we analyze in detail, and these are the RC2 scores, which is a measure based also on log linear models of the net association between the different pairs of classes. And so basically what you see in the pattern of Europe is that it's a very gradual pattern, and what you see in Latin America is that you have the rural classes very separated from the rest of the classes. This is a more polarized pattern in Latin America than in Europe. But in average, as I told you before, the social fluidity is more or less the same. So where do we go from here? Actually, I don't have a clear idea also about this, but especially when we compare. Well, let me just try to elaborate this. First, what I think are two important findings of this work. There are clear structural constraints to collective upward mobility in Latin America, and that has to do with the creation of labor market opportunities. I'm not saying anything special or new here, but it becomes very clear when we analyze and compare the class structures of Latin American countries and European countries that there's a lack of opportunities at the top, and this lack of opportunities at the top is based on the lack of creation of these kind of occupations. And so there's a structural constraint for upward mobility in terms of class mobility. And then also, as I told you recently, polarized societies produce a polarized chances of mobility. There's a lot of rigidity at the extremes of the class structure. However, this finding of social fluidity levels similar to those observed in European countries takes us to this question that was raised initially by Florencia Torche with her paper about Chile a decade ago already. Are we in Latin America unequal societies but fluid in terms of social mobility? Is this what we really are? Or is there that we have a complete or almost complete dissociation between class and economic mobility? So that's a very important question, I guess that is open to research. And David Krosky was saying this morning that there is not much, not theoretical developments, but also empirical work trying to relate these two forms of mobility, class mobility and economic mobility. It's something that we should do. So basically what I did, very preliminarily, is to make an analysis of economic mobility as we can measure it in the 2011 survey of the Centro Espinosa Yglesias. We have an indirect measure of economic standing of parents based on assets, household assets when the person was 15 years of age, and then current economic standing. And so we make the standard regression, and so we have a coefficient of 0.67, which is more or less online with the measures of economic mobility that you were mentioning before. Of course, it's a different measure, etc., but it tells you that we have a reasonably high association between economic origins and destination. So what I did is to create a multi-level model, a hierarchical model, where we have the same association, but then it's nested on the cross-classifications of class origins and destinations. And so what we have here is a second level, which is individuals who are nested on a combination of class origins and destination, and see how much of that association is absorbed by this cross-classification by class mobility. And so what we find is that, well, this correlation is reduced from 57 to 40, and the intra-class correlation is only 0.24. So this is telling us, basically, at least in the case of Mexico, with this imperfect data, that class mobility goes on one way and economic mobility goes in a different way. I think that this is a line that we should develop in the future, compare with other Latin American countries, probably with European countries and the US, and see if effectively we have completely different dimensions of mobility and what are the implications, both for sociological research on class mobility and economic research on economic mobility. Thank you very much.